Okay. Well, first of all, thanks so much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to see so many people here. I'll start off, I'll give you a little bit of background about myself. So I'm an entomologist at the University of Edinburgh. I just finished my PhD last year. So my real passion is Lepidoptera, and I've worked on a range of different aspects of Lepidoptera. So taxonomy, so classification, phenology. My PhD was based on stuff about the timing of life history events in Lepidoptera. But today I'm going to go back to what I think my original interest in this group and talk about coloration. And I'm pleased the title is intriguing. That's good. So to give you a little summary, what I'm going to do first off is talk very generally about different kinds of adaptive coloration in Lepidoptera. And then I'm going to zero in on a couple of these that I find particularly interesting and hopefully, and emphasize particularly camouflage or crypsis, and hopefully maybe change your perspective on that just a little bit. Let's see if it works. Okay, this works. That's good. So I always have to start off and talk about coloration by giving you this general slide like this, just showing you some of the huge diversity of coloration that you can see in the animal kingdom and among the plants too. Now, the sheer diversity of coloration in animals and plants has a long history of fascination among biologists, and you can kind of follow the thread of the history of biology through the study of coloration, going back to Aristotle, who talks about color changes in octopus when their mood changes, through to like Erasmus Darwin, Charles Darwin. So it is a subject of enduring fascination for people. And it always has a good reception at talks like this, compared to my phonology talks anyway. So if you think about the functions of coloration in Lepidoptera specifically, you can kind of classify these into two really broad groups. So on the one hand, physiological functions, so functions to do with the running of the body, and just very generally signaling, so really broadly defined, signaling among organisms. So as a physiological function, one of the things we can think about is thermoregulation. This one's quite well known. So we can see this among Lepidoptera in gradients in light-dark coloration. So they tend to get darker as you increase latitude and altitude, so they can absorb heat more efficiently. We all know this from clothing. You know, if you wear light colors, it's much cooler in sunny places. Some colors give actually inherent physical protection. So melanin can stop cell damage from ultraviolet light. Again, this is something we all know very intuitively, but you can see this reflected among Lepidoptera too. In terms of the signaling functions, we have what are called intraspecific and interspecific functions. So that's signals between individuals of the same species and signaling between individuals of different species. And these can be antagonistic or mutualistic. So basically good and bad. So they can be to the benefit of an individual or to the benefit of both. I'm going to zero in on these between species functions this morning, I should say. A really well-known example of this is apostatic coloration. So this is where you have really conspicuous contrasting colors placed together on an individual, and it usually signals toxicity or some kind of defensive mechanism that could harm a predator. So in this case, these burnet moths accumulate toxins from the host plants, so they're it's not wise to eat one. I always think burnet moths are hilarious because you can sort of jab them as they're sitting somewhere and they just do nothing. They just sit there. They're so unused to being harassed. So the flip side of that is mimicry. So the most well-known example of this is Batesian mimicry, so named after Henry Bates. And the idea here is that while you as an individual yourself can't cause any harm, or maybe you're not toxic, you just come to resemble a species that is toxic, and you kind of masquerade as that, and that's your defensive mechanism. So obviously these hornet moths, there's a whole group of them that resemble bees and wasps, and they have this characteristic color pattern. So they're harmless, but they come to resemble something that isn't harmless. So there are two kinds of between species signals that I want to zero in on this morning. And it's what I call really broadly concealed contrasting colors or concealed conspicuous colors. And then I'm going to lead into talking about crypsis or camouflage. So very broadly defined, you see very commonly among Lepidoptera this pattern where individuals are cryptic when they're at rest, and they can deliberately display some kind of bright contrasting color. So here you have exactly the same coloration you find on bees, wasps, and so on. this yellow-black contrasting color. And in large yellow underwings, when they fly off, all of a sudden this color becomes suddenly visible. But when they're at rest, they're very, very cryptic or camouflaged. So there are three really broad explanations that have been proposed for this phenomenon, and they kind of blend into one another, but they're quite separate explanations. So I want to kind of just go through those with you. I think it's very likely that they all operate kind of in tandem, but that will become clearer as we go along. So the first potential explanation is called deflective colors. So the idea here is that this large yellow underwing is very camouflaged when it's at rest, and it suddenly becomes disturbed by a bird that's coming along to eat it. All of a sudden, it flies off, it flashes these yellow colors, and the bird's attention is immediately drawn to the yellow colors. So when it attacks it, that's where the attack is directed. And so it directs the attack away from the center, the key parts of the body. Startle coloration is kind of related, but slightly different. So the idea here is that you suddenly expose bright colors or eye spots or something like that, and that frightens the predator. So it's instead of its attention being misdirected, it's kind of startled, it takes a step back, gives you time to escape before it attacks you. And a good, nice example of the eyed hawk moth here. So the last one, this is my favorite one because I think it's so subtle. Flash coloration. So the idea here is that you have your little moth in the corner. This is just a little example. And it has cryptic forewings, brightly colored hindwings. And so when it's flying along, you can see the bright color. And the idea is you as a predator are following it as it flies along. And all of a sudden, when it lands somewhere, suddenly it's camouflaged. So that bright color vanishes and you're just taken aback, and it makes it difficult to follow the moth and find out exactly where it is that it stopped. So hopefully this animation will work and it will give you an idea. Something like this.
Yeah.
Yeah. So your eye kind of immediately follows the bright line. And so anyway, that's theoretically how this mechanism is supposed to work. So you can see how each one of these could kind of be operating in the same system. There's kind of overlapping effects here. But trying to disentangle these different explanations, there's a lot of room, I think, for contributions to science. The literature is really quite vague on a lot of these, and the definitions are even often very blurred. So I was writing about this recently and discovered that there's actually very little literature, for example, on a really common species like the red admiral, about trying to work out what are the functions of the coloration here. You can see it's kind of cryptic underside, but it has this black-red contrasting upper side. And there's actually very few experiments that have been conducted to try and work out. For example, is it apostatic? Is it distasteful? It's not really very well known. So there's lots of scope for contributions by enthusiasts. So Crypsis. This is everyone's favorite thing. A couple of really broad examples here. I love the one with the leopard. It's very menacing. Another example is porcelain crabs, one of my favorite things. So they have all these little hairs and they collect detritus and algae, and they're just so perfectly matched to the underside of boulders on intertidal zones, and a nice little mountain hare in its winter coat. Of course, you can find a whole plethora of examples of exquisite camouflage in Lepidoptera. One of my favorites is the Merveille du jour. And you can see conveniently placed on some lichen here for the purposes of this photograph. But really, really exquisitely camouflaged. I mean, even when you see them, old specimens pinned in a drawer somewhere, it just leaps out to you that it looks so much like lichen. Buff tip is another lovely example. Whenever you see a photograph of a buff tip, it's always been placed on a twig. There's another one. So I think this is nice because it emphasizes two different kinds of crypsis. So you have what's called general protective resemblance, or general kind of camouflage, where you just come to resemble the general colors and tones of an environment, so you slightly blend in. So the leopard, for example, would be an example of that. This is very specific resemblance, so the whole body has come to resemble an object in the environment, not just the general tones. And so the organism itself becomes like a little piece of plasticine that's like shaped almost to the thing that it's mimicking in the environment. So even the way that the wings are held at rest here are all kind of modeled along that. It's a very compelling resemblance. It's one of those kind of irresistible just so stories. It's another lovely example, feathered thorn. An interesting point to note here is the lines that traverse both wings that give you this illusion of veins. So you can see how the way that the wings rest kind of interacts with the color, and it's become a palette on which these patterns have been painted. And of course, there's a whole group of moths that resemble bird droppings, which is bizarre. And this kind of bird dropping mimicry is a weird obsession that I have with this because it seems to have evolved so many times independently in so many different groups. Even in different families of Lepidoptera, you can find the same pattern. Really, really intriguing. But the kind of tones and the flecking and the shape, even again, the shape of the moth kind of lends some credence to this. This is a slight diversion because we're off to North America now, but this is my favorite bird dropping mimic. So this is the larvae of a giant swallowtail. You see the distribution there, North America on the left. And I don't know, it's just so compelling. Even kind of slightly disgusting, slimy texture. It's really, really compelling. So taking a step back for a minute and just to think a little bit more deeply about this crypsis or camouflage, I think we have to go back to very basics and think about what we actually mean by color. So fundamentally, color is a perception. It's a representation of the physical nature of the environment. So all these surfaces that we see, they have all the electromagnetic radiation coming into them, and the colors that we perceive them to be are the wavelengths of light that are reflected back, that aren't absorbed by the surface. And so it's obvious and our visual ability itself is shaped by natural selection. So primates, for example, seem to have a higher sensitivity to red colors because of, well, one of the theories behind that is that it's to do with detecting ripeness in fruit in our kind of arboreal ancestors. So you see here there are two things going on. Being camouflaged depends on the colors of the environment, but also the ability of the predators to kind of perceive colors, like the range of colors that they're able to perceive. So the thing I want to come back to throughout this talk is that camouflage is as much an adaptation to the perception, the sort of visual abilities of the thing you're trying to deceive, as it is to the environment itself. These two things are working in tandem. So let me give you an example of that. So here's a little fake background, the little triangles can be some fake moths. So imagine we have color vision. There are two species here. It's very obvious one of them is much more camouflaged than the other one. If we take a step back and change our visual system, so imagine we go to like a monochrome visual system now. I've taken the same image and just converted it to grayscale. So you can see here, if you have this visual system, suddenly both species look equally camouflaged or equally conspicuous, depending on how obvious you think they are. So the perception of predators, for example, it acts like a filter, and that defines the set of colors that matter. So that defines the sort of color space that you need to be cryptic in. These two things are working in tandem. So I want to jump from that onto this idea of cryptic polymorphism. So a nice little example of lesser yellow underwing. I like all the underwing moths. I think it's just so interesting. You think about camouflage, it's really the opposite of variation. You saw some like the buff tip, for example, earlier on. The idea is that you come to resemble an environment so perfectly that you're indistinguishable from it. That's the goal. So the idea is optimally converging on resembling the background, not being variable. But the fact is that many species that we see when we go out and we run the moth trap every evening, they are camouflaged and they are polymorphic, or they are variable as well. So that's a bit of a conundrum. How can you have maximal resemblance to the environment on the one hand, but on the other hand, we go out and we find them and they're really variable. So we want to know how evolution promotes, on the one hand, variation or maintains variation, and on the other hand, tries to promote camouflage at the same time. But one of the really conventional explanations for this is so this is again two little fake moth species. If you have this checkerboard background, you can think of polymorphism as being an adaptation to a polymorphic environment. So in this case, you have black and white environments that are patchworked together. In this case, it's if you're intermediate in color between black and white, if you're gray, you're mismatched on both of the backgrounds. You're obvious wherever you go. So there's selection that drives them to either be black or white, and you end up with two color morphs. So kind of fake illustration there. The other kind of, I think probably the more common kind of variation that we see though is something like you can see here in these winter moths. So don't really think of winter moths as being polymorphic, but they're actually quite variable within narrow bounds. And you see this really commonly, not just in Lepidoptera, but much more broadly. You see a general resemblance to the background, but at the same time, lots and lots of color morphs. This is much more difficult to explain. So we have our two kinds of polymorphism here, cryptic polymorphism. How can we explain this kind on the right? Well, I think if you go back to the literature, first inklings at a solution to this come from E.B. Poulton, who some of you may have heard of. A really excellent book, The Colours of Animals, that you can still read today. It's like full of really good anecdotes. But he talked about the caterpillars of the large emerald moth, which have these two different colour forms, the green and brown form. And he writes about them that, in this case, because the thinking about why they might have these two different colour forms, he says that foals have a wider range of objects for which they may mistake the larvae, and their search must occupy more time for equivalent results than if they just had one colour morph. So basically, they're making it more difficult for predators because they don't just need to look for one thing, they're trying to look for two things at the same time. So it reduces the overall kind of predation pressure. So we're kind of creeping towards a possible explanation here. Jump forward a little bit. The German biologist, not very well known today at all, Jakob von Uexküll. And this is a textbook that he wrote in German, a biology textbook. It's not very readable today, I have to say, in contrast to Poulton's book. So in this book, he has this interesting anecdote where he talks about visiting a friend's house. And every day the friend would have a ceramic jug of water on the breakfast table. And von Uexküll comes down one morning and he wants a drink and there's nothing there. And he asks his friend, can I have some water, please? And his friend says, well, it's right there. And he describes how all of a sudden he turns around and he says something like, all the shards of light suddenly come together and I realize, oh, there is a carafe there. It's just not ceramic, it's glass. And so trying to explain why he failed to see the carafe, trying to discuss it in modern terms, and he gives all kinds of similar wacky examples like frogs thinking matchsticks are worms and so on. Basically, what his argument comes down to is that the processing ability of your brain is limited, like a computer. I think it's about your optic nerve, I think, has the processing ability of a Ethernet cable, I think, approximately. So the idea is you have this hugely information-rich environment that you're trying to process information from. And it's impossible to take in all the information that's coming in. So you have to apply what's called selective attention. You have to devote some portion of your attention to one particular set of information that's coming in from the environment and ignore everything else. So this is called attentional filtering. So his explanation behind the whole thing with when he missed the carafe was that his mind had such a firm, fixed image of what he was expecting to see, and the fact that the carafe, the new one, was glass and it was like slightly camouflaged, that when he glanced around the table, he just couldn't perceive it because his mind had such a firm idea of what it was already looking for. This idea went kind of unnoticed for a long time, and then in the 1960s, Luc Timbergen kind of revived it. So he was in the Netherlands, he was looking at the control of insect populations in pine woodlands. One of the things he looks at is predation of these Bupalis moths by great tits. And he goes out and he records how common the moths are in the environment and how frequently they're brought back by the birds as food for their nestlings. This is one of the example graphs that he gives. So basically along the bottom, this is how common the moths are in the environment, and on the left, how frequently they're brought back as food. And the bold line that I've put on in the middle is what you would expect if the birds were just foraging randomly and they were just bumping into them. So that's a random chance based on how frequently the moths are found in the environment. Now, the dots are his actual records of how frequently they're brought back. And what you can see is that when the moths aren't very common, the birds bring them back less than we would expect by chance. And when the moths are very common, they tend to bring them back more than we would expect by chance. And this is just one example graph. So he found that in general, across lots of different insects, in the diet of these birds, there was an underrepresentation of prey species that weren't very common and an overrepresentation of ones that were very common. So to try and explain this, he revived von Uexküll's idea of the search image. And I'll break that down for you and give you and see how you think this works. So the idea again, visual environment, very complex, lots of information coming in. And birds have to go out and somehow search that environment for prey. And his idea is the birds would just wander along and they would by chance come across something that they could eat and they would consume it. And they would remember what it looked like, essentially. So they would say, okay, the visual characteristics of this thing, this is what prey looks like von Uexküll remembering the carafe's image. And the idea is then they would use those visual characteristics as a filter and apply it to all the information that's coming in from the environment. So they would be more likely to pick up things that look similar. I mean, we all kind of know this. If you know what you're looking for, it's easier to find something. And the idea is they would use that image, and if it was very productive, they would keep on using it. It would become reinforced in their mind. If it wasn't becoming very productive, then they would gradually forget about it. They'd come across another prey item. They would remember what that looked like, reinforce that image instead. So Tinbergen explained this by saying the overpredation of common prey results from the birds finding one of those, learning a search image, and applying it in the environment. There's no point learning an image of a prey item that's really rare because you're not likely to find it anyway. So you get then a tendency for them to consume more of a really common species and less of ones that aren't very common. Let me kind of break that down again. And his idea was then that differences in the abundance of different prey species determines which ones are predated. So you have a bird coming along, randomly goes through the environment, finds one of these little caterpillars, and it thinks, oh, this is what prey looks like. So it goes off, and it's much more likely to find one of those now. So it predates lots of them. The numbers go down. Other prey species, the numbers go up. Suddenly it finds this isn't a very productive image anymore. I'm not really finding many prey. So it bumps into one of these by chance. It's like, oh, maybe this is a good image. And it goes and searches the environment for these. So it may have a couple of things, a couple of images in its mind at the same time. They gradually get strengthened or they get forgotten, depending on which ones are most useful. And so you can see how it kind of leads to this thing where the common species get predated very heavily, get eaten very heavily, and the rare ones don't. Fast forward a little bit. Again, this is Brian Clark, who worked on polymorphism at Edinburgh for a little bit. And his idea was, he took this concept and kind of ran with it. So he said, well, from the bird's point of view, they're not predating different species. They're just predating things that look different. They're just going out and hunting things that look different. So there's no real difference between different species and a species that has lots of very distinct color morphs. The birds just see these as different things. And he worked a lot on banded snails, which some of you might be familiar with. And his idea was basically that you get that same mechanism of common color forms being predated within a species as you will between different species. So if you have one of these color morphs that's particularly common, you can imagine the birds remembering what that one looks like, predating that one very heavily, and these other ones managing to evade that image. Because as we were saying, the search image acts like a filter. So although it makes it more common that you will see something that matches your image, it makes it more likely, like von Uexküll in his glass carafe, that you'll miss something that doesn't conform to the image that you have in your mind. Yeah, so the idea is using predators that use search images to try and overcome camouflage, they'll exert this pressure within different species where common color forms are predated very heavily. And so this is the flip side of search image use, that looking different means you're more likely to evade a search image that a predator is using. And so this, coming back all the way back to the beginning with this idea of this general polymorphism, this could present a potential explanation for why we see this kind of really general polymorphism. So a general kind of camouflage in an environment, but at the same time, lots of variation. So there's a tension between selection on the one hand to be camouflaged, and on the other hand, a selective pressure as well to deviate from search images that predators are using. So it doesn't pay to be too conspicuous because then you'll be spotted like a mile away. But at the same time, you don't want to be too similar to the rest of the color forms because then you'll be picked out by the birds using that search image. So there's these two tensions going on. And this leads to a proliferation of lots of color forms that vaguely resemble each other, but they're not identical. I'll give you an example from my work specifically now. So this is a Bernard Kettlewell, some of you will know. Probably for his work on peppered moths, which is really famous now, is taught in biology classes all around the world. This idea of search images and polymorphism had kind of become quite well known by the time he was writing this book in 1973. And he preempted Kettlewell here. So that's basically what he says. Search image use is very well established. And the idea is that if you look different, you're more likely to evade a search image, so you might be at an advantage. And then he goes on to talk about moths that are active in Europe in winter. And he says that it's very common in these kind of species. And then he talks about how common it is. He gives an example. So he says, in Britain, there are a dozen species of Maculeptoptera hatch in the coldest months of the year. And he mentions how polymorphic these species are. He says they have at least 3 different morphs, and the morphs are themselves very variable. So this was a few years ago. Yeah, to give you some examples, dotted border, again, they're all kind of similar, but they're also different. Mottled umber, another good example. You can see how they all kind of cluster together and being generally camouflaged, but again, all different color morphs. a noctuid example here, a nice little chestnut moth. Again, kind of generally similar, but there's some variation between them. It's very different from the kind of the black and white polymorphism that I mentioned earlier on. It's not really discrete. You know, they kind of blend into one another. So if we have a look at these moths that are active in winter, based on Kettlewell's little anecdote, this is the basis of my research a few years ago. I went actually into the literature, had a look at this. If you look at the moth species that are active as adults in Britain between October and April, about 20% of them have more than 12 different color morphs, like named within species color morphs. But again, the primary defense against predation just seems to be Crypsis. It just looks like they're trying to avoid predation. So I wanted to actually test, are these search images the driving factor behind the evolution of all these color morphs in these winter-active moths? So I invented a little fake moth species. You can see it's based on the mottled umber here. And you can see just poking out at the bottom a little mealworm that's pinned underneath these fake wings. So it acts like a little edible body. And I went out into some woodlands and set these up in populations. I invented a few different color morphs. So I just modified the RGB values of the colors by 25. So I had this little cluster of similar color morphs. So I went out into some pine woodlands in Fife and set them up in populations of 20 individuals. So each one's pinned to a different tree. And the idea is that the birds will come in, they'll find one, and they'll be like, oh, this is a good food source. And then they'll hop around and try and find similar ones. And the idea is in these little small populations, they should be encountering them sequentially, and they should be forming a search image. So those pressures should exist, and so we can find out if they favor the really common color morphs, or favor the rare ones, I should say. So the birds come along, they predate them. So I left them out for 24 hours and came back and recorded the predation on the different color forms. Changed the population, different color forms, different frequencies, did it again. So I'm varying the frequency of each color form and using different color forms again. So what I found is that very simply put, this graph on the bottom shows you how common the color form is in the population, so from 0 to 1. And on the left-hand side, that's if you're an individual that belongs to that color form, how likely is it that you're going to be eaten? So if color doesn't affect how likely you are to be eaten, if the frequency of your color morph doesn't matter, this number on the left should only be determined by how many are eaten overall. So if the population is 20, the birds eat 10, your probability of being eaten should be 0.5. Doesn't matter what color you are. So it looks something like that. But instead, what I found when I analyzed all these results, this is for one color morph, for example, this brown one, is it looks like this. So what this means is that as the color morph becomes more and more common in the population, it becomes disproportionately eaten by the birds. So this kind of supports the idea they're hopping around, they're finding ones that are common, they're forming the image in their mind, and they're looking out for that one specifically. And it's actually meaning they're missing morphs that look different because they have this firm image in their mind. So what I found is that as a particular color morph becomes more common, the probability that it's going to be predated increases. So I'll bring in the work here of an undergrad student that I had a couple of years ago, Hannah Coburn, who kind of took this work a little bit further, and it's going to be published fairly soon, I think. Instead of using the moth models that I use, she used these little kind of fake caterpillar baits out of pastry and dyed them different colors with food colorings. And she set them out in little squares of square populations, and so quite dense. It's like a meter squared, and she put lots of color forms in there. And she left them out for predation by wild birds. The birds would come in and pick them, and you can see the magpie's got one there. So again, just to simplify this, don't need to worry about the different colors. Along the bottom, this is how many color morphs were put out in this population. So in this case, one morph in the population. So the whole population has only got one color, up to 5. And this is the time that the birds spent searching and to hunt all the baits that they got. So you can see that as the population becomes more polymorphic, as there are more and more different color forms put in this little quadrat, the time that the birds spent hunting increases. So it seems that when you introduce a variation into populations, it takes the predators longer, just like Poulton said a century ago, it takes the birds much longer to find all the ones that they wanted to clear out the population. Interestingly, she found, so in this case, the different lines are different species of bird. So the black one is crows there. She found that the effect was like different in different bird species. So again, it comes back to this idea of the predator psychology being really important. You're talking about there's the environment on the one hand, and then there's the sort of cognitive abilities of the predators on the other hand. And this varies among different species. So in the magpies, for example, it doesn't seem to be much of an effect. It doesn't matter how polymorphic the populations were, they just hunted them in the same amount of time. Coming back to Brian Clark for a minute, he made an interesting kind of deduction. He sort of thought that coming back to this idea of if a color form is very common, it's going to be predated really heavily. His idea was that if the species was rare, there's not much point forming a search image of that species because you're not likely to find it anyway. As a species becomes more and more common, it becomes more likely that it's productive to use a search image of that particular prey item. So his thinking was that as a prey species becomes more and more common, search images become more and more productive to use. And so the benefit of looking different from the image also increases. So what you'll find is that in much more common species, you gain a greater advantage from looking different. So from this, he kind of deduced that really common species ought to be much more polymorphic than really rare species if search images were driving this kind of evolution. Because if you're a very rare species, you can just look camouflaged. It doesn't really matter because they're not going to form an image of you because it's not productive. But if you're a really common species, you're subject to this really heavy pressure. Some of you, I'm sure, will kind of probably have thought this just anecdotally as well. It's really common species tend to be quite color polymorphic. Kettlewell mentioned this about the winter-active moths as well. He said that among the more common species, you find this really heavy polymorphism. So I went out to test this a couple of years ago. I wanted to find out if there was a relationship between how abundant different species of moth in the UK are and the number of named color forms. So I got the abundance data from the Rothamsted Light Trapping Network. And I went back to the literature and tried to, as a very approximate measure of how variable they were, look at how many named color morphs there were. The Victorians are very thorough about this kind of thing, so I thought it would be fairly reliable. And this is what I found. So this is species that are active between October and April as adults. And this is kind of complex. You don't need to bother about that really. It's just like how common they are along this axis. So as that goes up, they get more and more common. On the left-hand axis is how many named within species color morphs there are. And you can see as the species get more abundant, they get more and more named color morphs. So it does seem like in some groups there's a really strong correlation here. In certain groups of Lepidoptera, more common species really are more polymorphic. And in this case with the winter-active moths. So again, this is consistent with this idea that a really major selective pressure out there in the real world is predators like birds going around, forming search images, hunting to those images, and disproportionately predating really common color forms of different species. And that drives the evolution of new color morphs that look different. I feel like I'm laboring the point, but it takes a long time. It took me a long time to get my head around this. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of scope here. This is a really widespread cause of polymorphism. I'm sure all of you who do light trapping know that it's such a widespread phenomenon to see species that are generally kind of camouflaged. They sort of match the general tones of the natural world, but at the same time, they're also polymorphic. So, again, there's a lot of scope for work on this. How much of a driver of polymorphism is this kind of selection? And this is just, I mean, just one of hundreds of examples you could have here. So it could be a really major force. And again, the work just really hasn't been done on it. It could be a huge driver of driving the color patterns of these different species in nature. But just to wrap everything up, I'm doing quite well for time here. I'm quite happy with myself. So just to kind of sum all those various threads and pull them together. Lepidoptera have a huge array of really complex adaptive strategies in terms of their coloration, and I've really only scratched the surface of I've just covered really two major forms of adaptive coloration. The reason I took time at the beginning to mention this idea of concealed conspicuous coloration or concealed contrasting coloration is that I think it's a really ignored strategy, and I think it's underappreciated. Those three different explanations. Still, I mean, the work hasn't been done to try and pick those apart. Maybe one of them doesn't really work, and it's not just simply not been tested experimentally. So there's lots and lots of room for contributions to the literature there. The other point that I really want to emphasize is that all of these different strategies arise through a really complex interaction. It's not just about the colors of the environment, it's about the cognitive abilities, the visual abilities of the organisms that you're trying to deceive or the organisms that are perceiving you. So it's about the brains of the predators as much as it is about the properties of the environment that you're trying to resemble. And I think that as I've tried to, taking you through the story of this explanation for cryptic polymorphism, I think in many cases, adaptive coloration needs to be understood through this. There's like, it is fundamentally signaling, and there are two parties involved, and you need to consider it through this interplay of predator cognition and the environment, the properties of the environment. And as I've kind of mentioned all the way through, even in Britain, I think there's a huge amount of scope for future observation and experiment, trying to pick apart the various explanations for the huge diversity of coloration that we see in UK Lepidoptera. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jamie. That was a brilliant keynote. I absolutely love your invented mealworm moth. How many of those did you have to cut out?
Yeah, there's like 1,000, I think.
1,000.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Yeah.
Do we have?
Wasn't fun at the time. It wasn't fun at the time.
I bet.
Yeah.
Do we have any questions for Jamie in the room?
Yeah. So the question was that if common species are more polymorphic and rare species, there's not really that selective pressure to be polymorphic, what happens if a common species becomes rare? So I suppose you could imagine that the polymorphism would be maintained a bit because there wouldn't be necessarily selection against it. I think it would slowly, you could have the effects of drift maybe on the one hand, so they would stay in the population for a while. And I think it would depend the environment that they're in, how strong the selective pressure was for Crypsis. If they had a very variable environment, maybe it would last longer. But I think there would be a general trend towards convergence back on a different environment. Yeah, that's a really interesting question, though. There must be scope to investigate that now, especially with populations declining. So.
Another PhD student.
Yeah. Enough funding for myself, I think, is fine. The priority at the moment. So the question was that some common species are also really generalist in terms of the host plants that they eat. So I wonder if that could possibly contribute to the coloration that they have. I think it's difficult to disentangle the effects of host plant from habitat because they're so tightly tied to one another. And in each case, it depends on the individual behavioral characteristics of the species involved. Maybe they have very particular resting sites, and that affects the pressure on the coloration. So I'm not aware of anything. There's some work on what's called polyphenism, where the diet affects the morphology of the adults and the coloration. I'm not sure of anything really general that suggests different host plants can lead to lots of different color morphs. It tends to be very specific. So you'll have a brown form or a green form, and it depends on the food plants that they've been, or the particular parts of the host plant that they've eaten. I'm not aware of anything that suggests different host plants lead to different colors. It's certainly possible with different secondary chemicals in the plants, but I'm not aware of that. I mean, it's certainly possible, though. That's why you can really only deal in really broad generalities. You saw the really positive correlation that I showed you in the moths that were active in winter. If I showed you the graph I made across all of Lepidoptera, there is no correlation. So it seems to be this whole search image phenomenon driving polymorphism. It perhaps only operates really strongly in some really narrowly defined groups of Lepidoptera. But again, that's not really very well understood. So that's an interesting point, though. So the question was about the time frame over which they can kind of the birds can potentially come to learn search images and how long they retain them in their mind. So I think this is a really fascinating subject, which is why I wanted to mention Hannah's work really quickly, because it shows that there is this huge scope for differences among different species. And I think in the case of that particular experiment, it might be that the magpies just have a higher processing capacity in their brain. So it's not that they can remember more search images, it's just that they don't suffer the setbacks that the crows have. So the crows maybe have a more limited visual kind of processing capacity, so they have to form the images. So you see that effect, but the magpies can just process everything together. But I think there's a huge amount of scope for work on that. I know that Mike Majerus, who some of you might have heard of from Cambridge, a couple of decades ago, did some work where he looked at search images and found that they were formed in crows over the course of a few days. My experiments, I think it was mostly passerines that were predating them. So some of the, I should have actually showed you a picture, some of those little fake wings had little beak impressions on them. So I was able to get, because the birds would sometimes pull them off, eat the mealworms, so I found the wings on the ground. So I could kind of get a rough idea of what birds were involved. So with the passerines, it seemed like they could form the image in the matter of a few minutes, just how long it takes them to predate this little dense population of moths that I put out. So there's a huge amount of variation there, and I just think it's just not understood well at all.